Hi, and welcome to the FuSSO workshop. Today we'll be talking about how to draft a scientific STEM innovation proposal. And if you want to look over the slides for today's workshop, you can find it at the bottom right corner. It's bit.ly/FuSSO-proposal-workshop. So let's get started. So the objectives for today's workshop is the following 3 objectives. So the first one is to learn the fundamental components of a research proposal and the skills that are required to draft these proposals. The second one is to develop the first draft of your proposals and then receive some feedback. And the last one is to connect with other aspiring researchers in our program who also signed up for this workshop, and then there could be potential for future communications and collaborations. So today's workshop will be mainly split into 6 parts. So we'll start with introduction, and then we'll do a section that tells you about what is an R&D proposal. And then next, we'll break down each component of an R&D proposal. That's going to be the majority of the workshop since it's the most important, as in how you're supposed to write your proposals. And then the 4th part will be the practice, where we'll look at some proposal examples. The 5th one is that we'll get started on our individual projects. And then lastly, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll wrap up the workshop. So let's get started with part A. So part A is about introductions. So feel free to introduce yourself with the following information. So include your name, your education level, no matter which level you're at. I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to write a decent proposal after today's workshop, because you'll find that when you break it down to each component, it isn't that hard to do with enough research review done. And then the 3rd part, which is probably the most important, is to think about how you might summarize your current research interests. And then the last one is think about what you want to get out of this workshop. So there are many information shared today, and there might be some that you're already familiar with, and there might be some that are new to you. So make sure to know what you're hoping to get out of this, so you'll be able to get the most out of this session. So now that we went over that, we'll talk a little bit about why is it important to have a research proposal. So there are mainly 3 reasons to why you should write a thorough and good research proposal. So the first reason is that you'll be able to specify goals and directions for your project. And the second one is to determine the resources and funding that you need for your project. And then lastly, effectively communicate your plan to sponsors and collaborators. So starting with the first one, research, especially if you're doing a relatively big research project, is pretty easy to get lost in the little details and go down a rabbit hole that you forget about the general big direction for your project. So having a proposal that outlines it is really useful, since you can always refer back to it during your process of research. And then for the second one, obviously you're not just going to be sitting in front of your laptop and that's all the research you're going to do. You need to determine the resources and the funding you need. And this also connects to the 3rd reason. You need to find out who you want to go to for those resources and funding. And those are your sponsors and collaborators. So giving them this proposal would really help them understand your project in a more professional way and help them determine if they have the resources to help you and how much they're willing to devote into your project. And now we've gone over introductions, we will talk about what is an R&D proposal. So there could be 2 definitions for a research proposal. The first one is kind of for the researcher, which is you yourself. So a detailed document that outlines a planned research study, explaining the topic, research questions, methodology, and rationale behind the investigation. So this is mainly for your thought process as the main investigator. What topic are you trying to explore? What questions are you asking here? How are you going to do it? And why you're doing it? So this also relates to the different components of a research proposal that we'll talk about later. So this is mainly a document that is really helpful to you as the researcher. And then the second definition kind of relates to the people you're going to be collaborating with. So it is a blueprint to convince potential funders or reviewers of the study's significance and viability to conduct the research. So it is to convince those people who are going to help you and those people who are going to approve your project that this is a good project and it's something that's doable and it's something that's really important to this field of study. So a research proposal, as we mentioned already, helps both sides of this project, and it's really important to have it because it serves as effective communication and a general guide for your project. So almost all of the famous STEM projects that we know of, the innovations that were made, start from proposals because, as we mentioned, it is really a big and a complicated process. And in order to make these processes successful, it is important to have a guiding document. So some of us in the bio field might have heard of the Human Genome Project. Obviously, such a big and a collaborative effort started with a proposal. All of the iPhone models, they also likely started with proposals because these people at Apple need to figure out what new functions they want to add, what kind of, why would they add these functions, what resources do they need from their programmers or from their factories so that they could actually build these models, and how are they going to market these models. Those are all considered in their iPhone model proposals. And a third one, I think, is more related to engineering, the Manhattan Project, obviously also a big project that likely started with a proposal. And last but not least, the internet. It's so vast and so complicated that you can see how easy it might be when developing something like the internet to fall into a small detail rabbit hole and forget about the bigger picture that you're painting. So not just these projects, your project, even if it seems like it might not be as big of a shock as all of these projects here, should need a good research proposal in order for it to be successful. And here are the key components of a good research proposal. So we just talked about how important it is to have it. So how do we make it good and how do we actually make it useful? So these are the 6 main parts, which each of them we will break down in the next section. So the first one is a research question, and then you need a rationale, and then you need a literature review process, then you need a methodology section, you need a budget and time frame section, and lastly, you need a references section. So we'll talk about what each of these means. And that is our part C. So we'll be breaking down each of the components. So a research question is essentially the main question that you're asking for your study. Like, this is the question that you want to find out the answer to. So what does a strong research question look like? So typically a strong research question will have these traits. It would have a clear and specific wording. It will have an ability to fill a gap in its field. So it's not something that's exactly like what's already been done, then you're just repeating something and wasting resources. And lastly, you need to have a valid potential to really be doable and be viable, and also be able to lay a foundation that's helpful to future researchers. And on the other hand, a weak research question will have very vague wording, probably really general, a scope that is too wide. You're trying to find out too many different things. And then lastly, it's extremely similar to already researched subjects. So obviously it's okay and it's necessary for you to build on other people's research and to rely heavily on already existing research findings. But your project cannot be too similar to something that already exists because they already done it, and your research having so much resources and time and energy devoted to it should create an outcome that is new and helpful to the field. And now let's look at 3 examples of good research questions. So I know these aren't exactly STEM related, but from these we can really see the good traits that come with a good research proposal. So here are the examples. How does restricting electronic use at an early age affect children's social development? Why are health education strategies effective in preventing teen pregnancy in California? And how do gentrification and city development initiatives influence local school funding? So take a minute and read these good examples yourself, and then try to figure out what makes them good examples based on the traits that we talked about on the last slides. So basically, we can see that these questions all have very specific wording. So instead of just saying development, for example, it says children's social development. So there's two adjectives there that really narrow the scope of their research. And also in the third example, when it could have said, education, it really specified that it's local school funding. So that is a really specific aspect of education and, city development. So these really specific wordings make them good examples. And also we can assume that under these backgrounds, they add something new to their field. So these are something that no one's actually specifically looked at. So it makes sense that their studies are valuable and novel to their fields. And now that we looked at good examples, we can look at some examples that could probably use a little bit more work. So here are the examples that aren't exactly really good research questions due to many different reasons. So take a minute to look at these yourself, and then we'll look at how to fix them to become better research questions. So here are examples of how you might fix these research questions. So obviously, as you can see, these are much longer than the ones up there, meaning that there are more adjectives being added to the question to make the scope narrower and to make the study purpose more specific. So for example, for the second example, instead of saying this adding more lanes to a highway increase congestion, this is a very general question, and really depending on a city or even a district or the specific highway, it might really differ because different cities and different demographics have a really large effect on how traffic is going to play out. So instead of that, we could say, how do well-designed highways continue to contribute to congestion in the Bay Area? And that with a very specific location and a very specific description, this makes the scope a lot narrower and makes more sense that this is a study that could be done within a reasonable time frame. And one other thing to notice from this exercise is that good research questions mostly and almost always start with the word how or why. So instead of does or do, as you can see up there, two of them start with does or do. So the reasoning behind this is that, so questions like do, blah, 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 it really asks for a simple question. It really asks for just yes or no. And that is not that is not the answer you're trying to provide. So when you see those research papers, when they outline their findings, they don't just say yes or no. They have pages of analysis and reasoning and like a logical thinking process that is the answer to the research question. So instead of saying do and ask and making your brain think in a simple way that really just wants to find out yes or no, try to change your question so it asks how and why. So you're actually trying to find a logical process to explain your question instead of just providing a simple answer. Also, using how and why, since it implies that you need to provide a very complex answer, gives you more things to research about. So when you say, do low commuter schools have better student outcomes, you really just only need some data to show yes or no. But when you change it into how does the commuting rate of a university impact the students' academic performance, you have a lot of more things to wonder about. You have you have a lot of more things to research, and there's more parts to your study than just trying to find out the answer to yes or no. So that is a tip to keep in mind. So when you write your research question, try to make sure that your question starts with how and why to basically promote more thinking on your side. And the next component we're going to talk about is rationale. So before we start talking about what a good rationale looks like, we need to clarify its differences between rationale and background. So you might have seen a background section in one of those, or basically all of those research papers you've read. So a background section is really just descriptive. So it provides a lot of information on the facts and other research that backs up this research. It's really just information. However, on the other hand, a rationale is a balance of description and persuasion. So you not only need to explain, these are the information that I found, you also need to persuade your reader, who could be your sponsor or your reviewer, that this background is really relevant to my research, and these background information really prove that my research is valid and my research is necessary. So it contains background and establishes the research's significance. And with that in mind, a rationale does not, like the answer we want to our research question, is not a simple section as its name implies. It is like basically a line of reasoning that might answer the following questions. So why is your research relevant to its field? Does your research fill a gap in existing body of research? Does your research underscore or emphasize existing research? So here, it's like you can't obviously build largely upon another research. Actually, that's what you're supposed to do, but you shouldn't copy the research and analyze all the results from the same perspective. At least you need to provide insights into a different aspect of this topic, and to underscore or emphasize or maybe go against the findings of an existing research. And lastly, will your research add new, original knowledge to the existing understanding of your subject? And here we can look at an example rationale. So take a minute to look at it yourself and think about what kind of questions this rationale sample answers, and what writing techniques can you learn from this example. So what's really happening here, you can see that this is a good balance between description and persuasion. So when you look at the first sentence, it's obviously in the description part. So it described a statistics. It said in 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that 329,000 Americans were injured in cycling-related incidents. This is a fact. This is something, just by reading it, you can't understand how it might relate to anyone's research or anything at all, because it's just a fact that stands alone. But then when you read the sentence after that, it is part of the persuasion, and it's part of relating these facts to their research. So it says, if a system that simplifies the braking process and decreases stopping distances can prevent a small fraction of these injuries, then a large impact on bicycle safety can be made. So firstly, it's saying that, so many people get hurt from cycling-related incidents, so that proves that my research on simplifying the braking process, which will help prevent injuries, will really help this problem that exists in society right now. So you can see a good combination there. And then looking back on our last slide, it answers a lot of questions in just these two sentences. So it answers how their research is relevant to, transportation safety and, disease control. And then it also shows that how their research will prevent a small fraction of these injuries, so relating it to the bigger context. So it answers a lot of these questions. So you can see just from these two sentences the kind of logic that you're supposed to be having in your rationale section, and how you might combine describing facts to really using a line of reasoning to relate to your own study. And the next part we're going to be talking about is methodology. So your methodology section should do these 4 following things. So firstly, it should prove the practicality of your research. So methodology is basically outlining the specific methods that you're going to use to conduct your research. So obviously, by writing this section well, you can really prove that, see, these are the specific steps I'm going to take. So this proves how viable and how doable my research is. And then secondly, your methodology section should draw from literature review that you did and the previous successful procedures. So for example, if you want to do a research that involves bacterial transformation, there are so many people who've already done this process in so many different ways before you, and they've done it so successfully. So it doesn't make sense for you to just make up another procedure of your own and put it in your methodology section. And it definitely makes more sense for you to reference a successful procedure that you saw and you think will really work well in your study. So this is what it means by drawing from literature review and successful procedures, because you want to sound like your study is really doable. So you can be like, oh, so this person did this back in 20 something and it worked perfectly. So if I use the same procedure, it's going to work too. And that's much more persuasive. And then the third thing you're going to do is convince your reader why the procedures you plan are the best for this study and recognize some potential drawbacks. So as I said, there's so many ways out there that's proven to be successful for bacterial transformation, but your study might require the transformation to be kept at a certain temperature or a certain other condition. So you might need to filter this list of existing bacterial transformation procedures and choose the one that really fit your study the most. And then you have to explain why out of all those bacterial transformation procedures did you choose that one procedure that can happen under a fixed certain temperature. And you're going to explain that in the methodology section. Also, at the same time, you're going to explain some potential drawbacks and even better, how you're going to prevent or minimize these drawbacks. And then lastly, your methodology section should explain how you will interpret your findings. So in the end, you're going to be getting these data, and they might be numbers, there might be images, observations written down in words, but they can't just be the end of your research. You have to interpret them and find out what they mean and what kind of answers do they provide to your research question. So you're going to explain how you're going to use these findings that you collected. So for example, what kind of equation are you going to plug your data into? What kind of graphs are you going to make? And how are you going to interpret the trends? That's just for the numbers. And if it's qualitative, then it might be more complicated. So what kind of standards are you using to evaluate your findings? And are you comparing them to any previous studies? So these are all the things to explain in your methodology section. So it's really a long and should be a very specific section that literally just explains every single detail of what you're going to do. And this is an example methodology section. So take a minute to read it and think about where does it demonstrate the key things that we said should be done in the methodology section. So we can see that this sample starts with explaining a drawback of the method they're going to use. So it says the most significant risk to the experiment would be that if the specimens are too thin, they might tear, which will compromise the repeatability of the experiment. So they're recognizing this drawback, which isn't necessarily bad, and they're not afraid to do it because in the next sentence, they're going to explain how they're going to counter this drawback or minimize the negative effects of this drawback, and they did. So they said a contingency for this will be to try multiple thicknesses and see they're using this recognition of a potential drawback to explain why the method that they chose was the best for their study. So you can see that they're doing the convince part that we talked about here. So that is an example that you can reference when you write your methodology section. And next, we're talking about budget and time frame, which is also super important other than the sciencey stuff that you're going to do. So 3 things to keep in mind when writing a budget and time frame section. So firstly, you need to balance generosity with the mindfulness of how a very costly budget will likely not get the project approved and funded. So say if you try to save money or resources, then you buy every single material in the lowest quality and lowest price possible, they might actually break and they might not work, and your entire experiment might be sabotaged because you weren't as generous as you should have been when purchasing your materials. But at the same time, maybe it's not necessary for you to buy the most expensive version of every single thing you're going to use, because that will be a lot of money and you might just not get that much support, or people will be like, oh, that is a waste of resources and it won't help you or they won't improve your project. And the second thing is that like for the research question and for the methodology section, you need to be specific. You need to be really specific in terms of the monetary support and the time you need. You need to quantify them. You need to really write them out. So provide an actual timeline, provide an actual like record of all of the monetary support that you're going to need. And lastly, writing this section should really be a good opportunity to help you evaluate the feasibility of your project. So for example, you can use this section to evaluate if your scope is too big or too narrow. Say if you lay out your timeline and you find that you need so many years to just do this one thing, just find out this one small part of your study, then maybe you're doing too much. Maybe your topic is too general and too big, and you should really narrow it to one aspect of it so it falls into a reasonable time frame. And also, if you find that you can do everything that you need to do in like one day or a week, then maybe the scope is too narrow and you can explore some other aspects of your topic. So now we have talked about all of the sections except literature review and references. So for literature review, it's not really a section that you need to be writing in your proposal. It's a process, and basically you'll be reviewing research papers that relate to the research that you want to do, and that also relates to the references section. So at the end of the proposal, you need to provide a list of all of the, say, websites you visited and the journals you've read, the articles you've read that helped you develop your proposal, every single one of them. So my recommendation would be to use a tool, something like Citation Machine or Noodle Tools, or anything you can find to record every single thing that you visited and every single thing you used and drew from to create your proposal, no matter which section it is, and to keep it on one record so you can just copy and paste it when you're done with your proposal, because it will be really troublesome to go back and find your sources one by one. So make sure to keep an ongoing list of it, even if it's in early stages. You'll never know when you're going to want to read that one paper again, want to, look at that one article again. So it really helps to keep a references list. And now that we've covered all of the components, we can move on to practice. So for today's practice, we're judging a proposal. So if you go to the slides, so we have the link at the beginning. So the link is bit.ly/FuSSO-proposal-workshop. And if you go to the link and go to slide 22, you'll find these linked here. So the first proposal is accepted to a Yale first year fellowship, and it's more related to bio. So if you're interested in doing research in that area, this could be a good example to start with. And then the second one linked here is from MIT, and it's kind of more engineering related. So if your research is more similar to that, you can read that. And so what you're going to do is you're going to choose one proposal. And if you think neither of these interest you enough, you can find your own, but make sure that you have evidence that it was a successful proposal. So say it was accepted to some fellowship or it was given some grant, make sure that it's something that worked. So pick a proposal, and then in your proposal, pick the favorite section, which is the one you think is the most well-written. And also keep in mind that the sections might not be named as exactly as we talked about them. So there may not be a budget and time frame section, but you should be able to correspond each of the sections to something that we talked about. So pick your favorite section from your chosen proposal, and then read through it and think about why you think it's a well-written proposal and well-written section, and what can you really learn from it. So consider the strategies that they used in this proposal that you can steal and apply to your research. And then after that practice, we can get started on individual projects. So during this time, you should be able to complete at least the first draft of your research question. So remember, your research question is nothing fancy. It's just literally just a question. Keep in mind all the things that we talked about. And if you have time left over, you can start on your literature review. So for example, go to Google Scholar and type in the keywords relating to your research topic, and then you can start a literature review from there. Don't forget to keep a references list. And then once you're done with your research question, you can share out with other people in the program. You can share out with the FuSSO members running this program and being involved in it, and then you can receive some feedback if you want some. And then that is basically all for today's workshop. When you're done with your individual project research questions, if you have any other questions left over for this workshop, feel free to reach out to any of the FuSSO members, and they'll be able to relay your question to someone who can provide you answers. And that is the end of our workshop today. So we went over what an R&D proposal really is, and what are the basic components, how should we write it, how do we know if it's a well-written one or a not so well-written one. And then we practiced looking at different proposals, and then we got a head start on our individual projects. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And that is the end of the proposal. Thank you so much for coming.